Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to the first year, a town hall production by Daria Media supported by the MacArthur Foundation. It's been over a year since President Bola Tinubu took office in May 2023, and the economy has been the biggest thing on all our minds. Despite major economic reforms, unemployment remains high, inflation continues to rise, and poverty is still a major concern. The removal of fuel and electricity subsidies, as well as the devaluation of the naira, were steps taken in an effort to grow the economy. Our question today is, how far along are we on that journey? Over the next 2 hours, I will sit with a panel of experts who will share their thoughts on where we were in 2023 and where we are today. My name's Nabila Usman. I'll be your host for the conversation, along with my colleague Stephen Imedioglu, who will handle questions from our audience here in the studio and from you at home. How has the economy been treating you? Have you been able to put food on the table? What has it been like paying your electricity bills? Join the conversation. You can engage with us using the social media details scrolling across your screen. Before the conversation begins, we'll take a message from Dr. Kole Shatima, Country Director of MacArthur Foundation. He joins us to share why MacArthur funds efforts such as ours.
Thank you very much, Nabila, for this wonderful introduction. And I welcome our viewers across the country, across the world, and those who are here in the hall. I want to say that on behalf of the MacArthur Foundation, we are very happy to support this initiative. The MacArthur Foundation is committed to ensuring accountability in our country, and we do that by supporting many government institutions and organizations, but also supporting civil society organizations as well. So today we are having this conversation around the first year of this administration. And as the moderator said, this is a conversation which will focus primarily on the economy. And I'm sure that we are all here to learn, to hear, and to share experiences of what have been the first year's administration's programs and policies are. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to support this worthy cause. Thank you very much.
I say to you here and now that as we celebrate the enshrinement of our political democracy, let us commit ourselves to the fulfillment of equally important counterpart, the realization of our economic democracy. I understand the economic difficulties we face as a nation right now. Our economy has been in desperate need of reform for decades. It has been unbalanced because it was built on the flawed foundations and over reliance on revenue from exploitation of oil. The reforms we have initiated are intended to create a stronger, better foundation for future growth. There is no doubt that the reform has occasioned hardship. I feel your pains. Yet, there are necessary repairs required to fix the economy over the long run so that everyone has access to economic opportunity, fair pay, and compensation for its endeavor and labor. As we continue to reform the economy, I shall always listen to the people and will never turn my back on you. And I commit myself to this work until we have built a Nigeria where no man is oppressed. In the end, our national greatness will not be achieved by traversing or traveling the easy way. It can only be achieved by taking the right one. The words of American President Franklin Roosevelt sadly rings true, and I quote, "There are many ways of going forward, but only one way of standing still," and unquote. We dare not slumber, lest the good things awaiting our immediate future pass us by. We dare not plant our feet in the idle standstill in the middle of the intersection of hope and despair. We know the proper way forward, and we shall take it. The initial rays of brighter tomorrow now appears on the horizon. An abundant future and our capacity to achieve that future lies within our reach.
Welcome again. You're watching The First Year. You've just heard from President Bola Tinubu some of the many promises he's made since his time in office. I know at this point you're expecting me to introduce a prestigious panel of ministers who are to engage on this conversation. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it. We're as disappointed as you are, but one ministry did send a representative who joins me this morning. I have Modibo Azubair, who is Special Advisor on Economic Expansion and Job Creation to the Minister of Arts, Culture and Creative Economy. Mr. Azubair, it's a pleasure to have you here. So I want to start the conversation with the 8-point agenda of your ministry. It's been somewhere around a year since the minister took office. Can you speak to us about the milestones that have been achieved since then?
Thank you. So the 8-point agenda at its core was really about the long-term ambitions that we're trying to achieve as a ministry. The reality is that trying to speak in specific milestones doesn't really do justice to what economic expansion and job creation is really going to entail at this point. The reason I'm saying that is that primarily, in order to grow the economy, it requires a lot of foundational aspects to be put in place. As everyone here will be well aware, the ministry was a brand new ministry. What that means is there's an entire administrative apparatus that needs to be properly brought up to speed and made sure that each of the constituent departments are properly understood and provided with the support that they need. So in terms of the actual milestones, they are primarily around the actual foundational aspects that we've been able to lay down, which will then allow us to eventually get to the two key barometers of how we're measuring success, which is the 2 million jobs created and the 100 billion. Having said that, we're incredibly proud that we've been able to do on the work in terms of the policy foundations we're trying to implement. So by way of example, we've already reached the agreements with the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. We have 6 foundational policies on IP protection, on the creative economy, on the cultural policy, on tax and incentives, which again are going to be laying the foundations. And we're actually at the very final stages of the WIPO IP policy review. So that's just a key example of a sort of foundational policy which is going to pay dividends over the long term. Secondly, we've been able to really enhance our ability to attract partnerships and investments. As people will be well aware, as the public will be well aware, there was a major announcement with the minister's appointment to the Creative Advisory Africa Group of Afrexim. This promises to be one of the one of the most consequential sort of infrastructure vehicles, or at least strategic vehicles when it comes to supporting the creative economy, both on the continent, but us as a nation that seeks to become both a regional hub and an international hub, is going to place us at the forefront of being able to drive that sort of regional change for a new economic model. We can also point to specific successes we've had on UNESCO inscriptions. The Sango Festival in Oyo State, which we've had recently described the Asaba Film City, which has also joined the broader collection of cities that have been added to that, which again is aspects that it will drive investment in the long term. But for me, as the individual, as the SA responsible for economic expansion and job creation, it's critical that we take an intelligent approach to how we look at the economic challenges that this country is facing. It's not the case that when you're building an economy that you can name specifically as these quick masters that come along. It doesn't work like that. It's quality.
I will come to the point of where the ministry fits into the larger economic picture. But the minister's gone on record to say that the creative economy is essentially the next oil, right? You've mentioned $100 billion as a target and the millions of jobs that you're looking to create. In practical terms, what does that look like?
I mean, to be honest, it's probably not going to be a popular opinion, but I almost think calling it the new oil does it a disservice, because oil is, it's a stratospheric kind of part of the economy, in the sense that it's not something that necessarily we all immediately can benefit from in the same way that, let's say, something like the creative economy, right? The reason Nigeria so outperforms almost so much above its weight when it comes to the creative economy is the fact that it's something that people everywhere engage with. Every region of this country, every state of this country has a rich, proud cultural heritage, cultural tradition. And so that is the aspect of it that, for me, I think is actually, it's not even about it being the new oil, it's about a new economic model that really ensures that growth is being felt for the people that deserve it most and need it most. And so that is I think, the transition that she was really trying to speak to when she was using that phrase. I apologize, I think there was a second part to your question.
You started to answer it, and this then begs the question of what engagement has been like with the private sector, especially because private players within the creative economy have always been the biggest drivers of that economy. So how does government lay the foundation to help them do this better?
I'm really glad you've asked that question, because, the creative sector in Nigeria, it was abandoned. It was left to do everything. It was a nascent industry, which, when everyone else was looking at, your usual commodities, your oil sector, they built this up from the ground up. It was a private sector that built this on their own merits, primarily young people, primarily people that didn't have access to the same kind of opportunities as the people that you'll see in the oil sector, in the other areas. And so the foundational aspects of the way that we've been trying to implement has been about how do we allow the private sector to flourish? How do we get them to the next stage, as opposed to this model? And I think this is what a lot of people's concerns are. A lot of, when we speak to the private sector, they are worried because they've had to do this all on their own, and they're worried that government's going to come, sit on top of them, tax them out of existence, make life difficult, because they're now seeing now there's a sector that's doing well for itself. So the way that we've been working with them is we're really trying to use a light touch. That doesn't mean the state doesn't have a really critical role to play. And so, for example, in areas like infrastructure, which is something that the private sector perhaps is less capable by design, able to access the funding, to bring things together, that's the way that we're trying to support them. Likewise, light touch in terms of being able to provide the capacity and the skills training to make sure that they have the people that they need. Light touch in terms of the sense of making sure that, if there's a film production company, that in order for them to access the equipment they need, that's a big issue right now for certain types of film production. We only have two of the right kind of camera to be able to do it. And so it's about doing things like, changing import duty waivers to make it easier for them to access. That's how we're trying to engage with the private sector. It's about letting them do what they're doing, and us coming up underneath and filling in the gaps in areas that they haven't been supported. And I think the best example of this, I know I've given quite a few, is the work we're doing on the IP policy. IP is essential to allowing Nigerian creatives and those who have already been able to successfully build the sector as they have, to be able to actually monetize on it, so that you don't have actors dying on their feet when they're having to work almost like on a stage-by-stage basis, but they can actually get royalties for it, when they can access loans to be able to increase the productions and the size of the production, the quality of the productions, building partnerships, standardizing agreements, so that, for example, when major international players want to come and invest in the space, they know exactly the contracts they can go into. They know exactly how much they're investing. They know how they have a clear idea of doing that. That's the way that we're trying to engage with the private sector.
So I do wonder at what point we start to see a tangible form of this engagement. And I ask this because the administration so far has had a number of plans in the pipelines, and people are at a point where they want to see results. When are we going to start to engage and actually see something tangible?
I recognize the urgency. I really do. I think it's clear to everyone that Nigeria is facing a really, really difficult situation when it comes to the economy. And that's why, like I said, and this is not an academic point, it's critical that we take so much more of a longer term view about how we can deliver to the economy. I would say in terms of tangibly, the ways that people are going to be see this, it's going to be things like, for example, once the IP policy is up and running, they can tangibly be able to find it easier to be able to access loans on the securitization basis. It also means that, for example, the work that we have been doing with a lot of our partners in the sector in terms of the job, sort of the low-level job creation, the really easy low-level hanging fruit, and that is paying dividends. And I think if you look at the statistics out of the targeted 1.8% growth that we've been looking at, we've actually, 1.8% by the end of the year, we've already reached that 1.6% milestone. But again, I make this point because what does that mean for most people? Do they feel...
And let me interrupt you. You say that you've hit 1.6%. What does that look like? How are you measuring it?
So again, and this is again something else that we're really trying to do, right? Even the metrics that we use to measure this stuff isn't as well developed as it should be. This is obviously dependent right now on the statistic provided by the National Bureau of Statistics. But again, this is part of the growth, the foundational growth we're trying to do at the ministry. Some of the agreements we're doing, it's about how do we properly measure what does 1. Yeah, you're right. What does 1.6% mean for everyday person, right? That has to go hand in hand with a quality job, rather than, for example, the same big film production studios, which right now, that is the reality of where the growth is being felt at the top. And so in terms of the actual, the way that it's feeling for the everyday person, we're still getting there. But that's, again, but even if we are trying to measure that, we do not have the right apparatus at an institutional level to do that. And so that's, again, why the minister has been so clear about, in order to make sure that this slogan of diversification, of, different economic, you've mentioned how many plans have we seen in our lifetime for various different aspects of how to grow the economy? So again, it's about really being able to actually say, okay, this is what we want to do, and this is exactly why we know it's having the impact we want it to have.
So one of the plans that's been mentioned is an intention to build a national theatre, another national theatre. We already have one, and in many ways it's not lived up to its expectations. Is that really the best use of resources? Is that what we should be doing now?
So I just out of curiosity, what is it that makes you feel like it hasn't lived up to expectations? Because I think if I understand the expectations, I can better articulate what the value of it is.
I mean, if we make comparisons to countries that have some sort of, or place a premium on the arts, right? You're talking about events happening every other weekend during the week. You're talking about people being able to buy tickets to actually go and see these performances. You're talking about performances beyond theatre productions. There are other things that space can be used for. And if you go to Lagos and see the newly renamed Wole Soyinka National Theatre, you know that this building is not living up to even half of its standard. So if we have an existing one, it's been there for years, should we really be funneling scarce resources into building a new one?
I understand. I absolutely understand the, what's the word? Is it consternation, the reticence about the idea of building a new theatre. The first thing is that these are not mutually exclusive. We can revitalize, and I know that there's a lot of work that we're doing about revitalizing our key infrastructure to bring them up to standard. So I don't think the case that we're building a new one firstly, it stops us from firstly doing that part of the job, which I think you alluded to. The second thing to understand about the way and the strategy that we have when it comes to infrastructure. Yes, from an economic perspective, there is a lot of benefit in terms of, well, there is some benefit, I should say, towards the domestic market and towards being able to hold these shows and the rest of it. But again, where is the actual money that people are looking for going to be coming from? And so something like a new national theatre allows us to actually be able to develop talent, develop the skills acquisitions. It allows people to be able to, because having spaces for people to actually grow and being able to master their craft is critical to us being able to improve the quality of our work and to then actually being able to display at an international, at a more international, there's a metaphor, but stage. Now, specifically the new national theatre, just in the same way that, for example, traditionally in Nigeria, a lot of our artists and musicians have grown up through the church and have used the church to be able to hone their musical skills, to be able to, that's the real benefit of what we're doing. So I wouldn't see it so much in terms of it as it being a sort of a sunk, sort of a wasted cost in terms of, we need, it's not supposed to be some edifice, some monument to our ego. It's supposed to be a place for an infrastructure for training and development.
I do understand that. And the reality with the arts is that, and you can ask people who do other things beyond movies or even big time musicians, right? I think about people who organize festivals, for instance. They will tell you that more often than not, or with every instance, they do run at a loss. And that holds true across different art forms in many parts of the world. The arts are not necessarily always profitable. So, how do you intend to convince Nigerians who are hungry, right? And this isn't it doesn't fall under the purview of your ministry, I understand that. But how do you convince them that the resources, whether it's by way of manpower or financing, whatever the case is, that this is a ministry that's critical to Nigeria's survival?
Ooh, I'm trying to think of the most succinct way of saying that. I think the first thing is to realize that we are living in a changing global context. It's not going to happen overnight, but the energy transition is real. People are moving away from oil as climate change becomes an increasingly devastating issue. I mean, we see it in ourselves in the north. We were recently in Katsina. And so the fact is, we need to come up with a new economic model. And so, yes, perhaps not every single cultural venture is going to be this great profit-making enterprise. But again, if you look at, let's say, the Afrexim Global Trade Report they did in 2022, they recognize this, and this is why they're so invested in this. This is the African Infrastructure Bank. Like they have no they would this is not a kind of sector that they normally be interested in if they didn't see where the wind was going, right? And they are and they recognize the fact that this is going to be a key economic driver, not just for Nigeria, but on the continent. And that's why, by appointing our minister to the advisory board, they want us to be the champion for this different economic model, because it engages young people much more effectively, it's sustainable, it's cleaner, it works with what, content production is worth its weight in gold at the moment, because, and it's something that inherently Nigerians do better than anyone else. Right? There are so many countries that would give so much to be able to have the kind of content produced. And the thing is, right now as well, it's just it's a tiny percentage of the potential that we have. The artists that just on music alone, right? Talk less about all the ones. So that's the first thing I would say, is that it is a viable economic strategy. The second, and I understand it's not necessarily our purview, but culture is essential to the way that a nation exists and experiences itself, and it has an inherent value to the way that we see ourselves and are able to go forward. So many of the challenges that we face, from a civic perspective, from a public, from an institutional perspective, is that we don't really appreciate, we don't really value the way that our culture exists within us. And I see this all the time. And I mean, I can give you specific examples, right? The number of times you'll go into like an international auction house, right? And you'll see various, particularly, for example, pieces from Kano from 200 years ago being sold, because these are pieces of our history that are valued by other people, collectors, investors, blah, blah, blah. And so for us, we also simultaneously see that not only are we trying to develop a new economic model to benefit and make sure that people actually in the long term are able to eat, to live, to have a quality standard of living, but also to make it so that we as a nation can deal with this like inferiority complex that I think we deal with on a regular basis. It's about making us feel stronger about our heritage, and ultimately, as more people decide then to invest in Nigeria, feel proud of their country, that will also have economic benefits. But again, it's a longer term process.
So that cultural side is the intangible. And one would argue that the deliberateness of shaping that perspective has been left by and large to private actors. Perhaps the biggest thing about Nigeria at the moment is the music industry, and you can, of course, name all the stars. They do have some sort of model that works for them. So when you see newcomers, they're trying to replicate that model, a model that was created outside of government, a deliberateness that was created outside of government. In 1 year, can you say that your ministry has actually worked to be deliberate about shaping this culture not just for Nigerians, but just the potential to export it even.
Sorry, just to be clear, are you talking about the private sector culture or just culture more broadly?
I'm saying that the private sector seems to be the one that has been more deliberate about shaping that culture, not so much from the government perspective.
Right. Okay. I think I understand. So, yes, because the private sector. So, are you talking? So, just to be specific about the intangible aspect, yeah, the private sector has been at the forefront of that. And again, I think it goes in many ways that shouldn't necessarily be separated from the culture because Nigerians are world renowned for being a very entrepreneurial people, and so as a result, I do think the private sector does have an important role in terms of how it tries to define and tries to shape our culture.
So, if I may, my argument is that it seems the private sector understands that. And in many ways, it's because it does affect the bottom line for them. But for government, shaping culture is not about profit, right? When you talk about China, and for instance, the Panda Exchange program that they have, that's soft influence. So, to what extent would you say that this ministry understands that and has been working to establish that deliberateness in 1 year?
Oh, I see. So the ministry does understand that, but I think just like your earlier question alluded to, I think our primary priority really has been around the economic side of making sure that we're driving growth. So the reality is that doesn't always come out as at the forefront of the work that we're doing. However, having said that, we are doing a lot when it comes to cultural preservation. So that's a clear example of us trying to be able to work with local communities, with people with cultural institutions, and so, for example, the 2 UNESCO inscriptions that we've been able to get. We are currently working at the moment to try and develop a much more civically minded strategy for how we are developing our cultural industries, because we actually believe you can tie our cultural heritage in many areas to what the opportunities for economic growth are. So it's not necessarily the case that it's being ignored, but I think the reality is, both in terms of presidential prioritization number 7, which is about accelerating growth. The reason the ministry was set up, we have had driving economic development at the forefront of what we're doing.
So a little earlier, you mentioned creatives being concerned around, taxing essentially their businesses or their art. And the truth is that there's always a fear about the tax man, right? And I do wonder the extent to which the rest of the government understands this, right? How much engagement is the ministry having with, especially the tax reform committee that's working at the moment? So talking about tax incentives and any sort of fiscal incentives for the sector.
I mean, firstly, I understand that, but also we shouldn't be scared of paying taxes. Taxes are an essential part of the social contract we have. I recognize, obviously, there are dynamics involved that make it difficult and frustrating, but the reality is, if we want the kind of country we want to build, it's important that people pay their taxes, recognize the importance of this, because that's how we develop, that's how we grow, that's how we get to where we're trying to be. In terms of the work that we're doing on tax and incentives, as you mentioned, there is the committee that's currently engaging with it. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to necessarily go into the specific proposals, but I can talk about what the outcomes of what we're trying to do are supposed to be, and the way we're shaping our tax plans and what we're trying to achieve with it. And that is primarily to turn Nigeria's creative cultural sector into a services industry for culture. So almost like a cultural manufacturer. So what does that mean in practice? Say, for example, you're a major production studio based in America. The vast majority of your costs are going to be things like FX, After Effects stuff. It's going to be around sort of, being able to do whether it's the stage design, all the props, whatever it is. And so we already have this model that's been provided for us by South Africa. So a lot of major film productions have been moved to South Africa, where they're able to use their natural environment and their relative contractual strength to the studio's benefit. And so what we're trying to do is make it easier for foreign production companies to be able to come to Nigeria on the basis that they're employing Nigerians, providing the skills, and then able to outsource that work to productions that are taking place, because that's how you get foreign currency into the country. That's how you get foreign expertise into it. Simultaneously,
let me interrupt you for a moment.
Yeah.
Do you think that perhaps that's counter to the administration's focus on local capacity, local production?
So that is centered around. So the thing about production, especially the manufacturers, like it's labor heavy. It requires significant personnel, right? And so that's again what we're trying to attract, so that we are actually getting these companies to hire as many Nigerians as they possibly can. But simultaneously, we're also trying to make it easier for local production to be able to expand and to grow. How do you do that? You work on issues like corporate tax rates. You change the rules around, for example, import duty waivers on equipment. So that, for example, like I said, right now, one of the big issues holding up major productions in Nigeria is the fact that they have to wait because there's 2 cameras of a certain type in operation in Nigeria. So to make it easier for that stuff, and that requires creating sort of equipment passports, working with international partners to make it easier to be able to get that about. We're also talking about tax incentives. So for example, if you're a production studio or prospective production studio in Nigeria, and you want to build a studio, again, giving you sort of tax incentives, so that when you build that studio, we recognize as a critical piece of infrastructure, and that way you are able to make it more financially viable and increase local production.
And would you say that the local sector, the local economy, the existing one, is taking to the plans that you've made? What's engagement with stakeholders like?
So I'm here today. I'm here to this is why I'm here, and really excited to be able to express some of the ideas, because I know that when the ministry was announced, there was a lot of sort of excitement about it, and I think people have been understandably sort of tetchy around what exactly is going on, and that's why I'm here today to try and explain that because we care so deeply about the long-term ambitions we have for the sector, and about again doing this the right way. Because again, how many times have we been disappointed? It's easy to announce projects, it's easy to disperse money for build a bridge, do this, whatever it might be. But this is about really creating the right ecosystem, to the extent that hopefully it becomes second nature, that when a creative goes to the bank, is able to get money for their creations and develop what they're trying to do.
Thank you, Mr. Azubair. At this point, we will be going on a quick break. But look, the creative economy is just one subset of Nigeria's economy. It's a much larger conversation. And when we return from the break, I will be joined by a panel of experts who will take an overview of the economy, and the conversation on the first year continues. Stay with us.
At TVC News, wherever the big news story is happening, we're geared up to break it.
Bola Ahmed Tinubu.
1 year ago, a new government stepped into the spotlight and took the reins of our nation. The promises were grand, the challenges immense. And Daria Media, with the support of the Makoto Foundation, presents The First Year, a comprehensive review of our government's progress, achievements, and the areas that need attention. We will hear directly from the government on the work it has done in the areas of the economy, security, and governance in the last 1 year, with the renewed hope agenda of His Excellency President Ahmed Bola Tinubu. Engage with expert analysis, listen to diverse voices, and witness the transparent assessments of the promises made. Watch and listen directly to government representatives.
Bola Ahmed Tinubu.
1 year ago, A new government stepped into the spotlight and took the reins of our nation. The promises were grand, the challenges immense. Daria Media, with the support of the Makoto Foundation, presents The First Year, a comprehensive review of our government's progress, achievements, and areas that need attention. We will hear directly from the government on the work it has done in the areas of the economy, security, and governance in the last 1 year, with the renewed hope agenda of His Excellency President Ahmed Bola Tinubu. Engage with expert analysis, listen to diverse voices, and witness the transparent assessments of the promises made. Watch and listen directly to government representatives.
By Daria Media, supported by the MacArthur Foundation. I'm Nabila Usman. We're discussing the economy under the stewardship of President Bola Tinubu and his economic team. And at this point, I'm pleased to introduce the panel of experts who are joining me in conversation. I have Rabiu Hassan, who's Managing Partner and Chief Investment Officer at Positive Markets Investments. Also, Dr. Paula Laje is Chief Economist at SPM Professionals. I have Okoyemi Agbaje, who's Economist and CEO at RTC Advisory Services. Waziri Adio is Agora Policy founder who joins us in conversation, along with Muhammad Shuaibu, an economist and senior lecturer at the Department of Economics, University of Abuja. And of course, I have Modibo Azubair, special advisor on economic expansion and job creation to the Minister of Arts, Culture and Creative Economy. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on the conversation. Now, because we are going to take a look, a bird's eye view, really, at the economy from May 29th up until this moment, I want to start with you, Mr. Adio. Give us an overview, right? Without sentiment, just looking at whether the positives or the negatives. Where are we with the economy? How have we fared?
Thank you very much. I think the first thing I want to say is that by the time this administration took over last year, Nigeria was actually approaching a crash. But because the crash had not happened, it's still difficult for people to wrap their heads around it, right? In 2022, we spent $10 billion on petrol subsidy alone. Deficit was getting out of hand. Debt service was taking like more than 90% of revenue, right? So that was the background, and something had to be done. The president came and he took some quick actions on two areas. The first one was on removal of petrol subsidy, and he did it, off script on inauguration ground. Then, like 2 weeks after, they floated the naira. In terms of effort, I think the administration or the president should be given an A for having the guts to take quick and necessary action. But you can also do the right thing in the wrong way, and that is what we're dealing with now. So if you look at all the indicators in May 29, 2023, and where we are now, all the indicators are in red. Whether it's food inflation, whether it's headline inflation, whether it's the value of the currency. I would say those were necessary steps, but they were not properly phased rather. Removing fuel subsidy by itself is consequential enough, is significant enough. But even before you remove that, you have to make sure that you have adequate plans in place for how to accommodate those who would disproportionately lose out from the removal of fuel subsidy. We didn't do that. Up to now, we're still trying to do that piecemeal. But before we could adjust to that, you introduce another shock, which is the floating of the naira, and that is even more consequential in the sense that the petrol subsidy that you removed, we import most of the petrol that we consume. So at any point when the value of the naira goes down, that means the price of petrol will continue to go up. And at some point, they had to pause the price of petrol. So whatever it is that we gained from removing petrol subsidy, that petrol subsidy is back. That is one. Two is, if you want to do something like floating your currency, you need to have a plan in place. I don't think it's actually the right thing to do. Maybe what we should have done, if you think that your currency was overvalued, maybe you should have devalued gradually. Nobody put a gun to our head to embark on this free float kind of thing. And even if you want to do that, you need to make sure that you have adequate supply in place. We don't have that. And I listened to the CBN governor in the clip that you played before. And I think his administration, they've been battling, to save the situation, but there's an issue of supply. As long as you don't have enough liquidity, the price of dollar will continue to go. Thank you.
I'll interrupt you, and perhaps I'll throw this question to you, Mr. Agbaje. I may be going all the way to the end with this question, but in light of what Mr. Adio has outlined for us, is this the time to review, recalibrate, and retrace our steps?
I think so. I think that with fundamental structural economic reforms that had been paused with effect in Nigeria over a decade ago, maybe we had the last substantial reforms around 2012, 2013, both of which failed. The attempt to remove the subsidy by Jonathan in 2012, the attempt to privatize or the actual privatization of power sector around the same 2013 and so. And since then, there had been no fundamental economic reforms. So one of the things, and I broadly share Waziri's view, so we don't remember the context so often. One, the social and economic conditions at the time, the people were already very poor, unemployment was high, there was a lot of insecurity. So the context was going to be difficult. It was going to be painful. It was going to be difficult to implement. Our politics had become a little bit more toxic. That's part of the context, and that's part of what makes it more difficult. And then that fact that much of the experience with reforms had been lost. The insights, the experience had been gone away with the teams that were carrying out reforms then. So clearly, some things have not worked, evidently. And I think the biggest thing that hasn't worked, with the benefit of hindsight perhaps, the sequencing, the timing, the mode of implementation. So the strategy is right. Nobody can question with the big strategic decisions that the government has made. The tactics are very debatable. Sequencing, timing, scale, mode of implementation. So the most significant one was either alluded to the FX deregulation. Might it have been delayed? That's with the benefit of hindsight, but we're where we are. Might we have embarked on a managed float? Okay, so the currency was overvalued, so we needed to shift it. Could we have just chosen where we wanted and devalued to that point and tried to manage around that point instead of a managed float over which we lost control? So all of these issues we need to now, any policy environment has to be monitored and evaluated and sequenced, and you have to ask yourself what's working, what's not working. I think there are other things that may not be working that we need to address. One of them is, I've mentioned the tactical side, sequencing, planning, mode, scale, timing, all of those things. There's also communication. If our people have been in the state of impoverishment and apathy, and the politics were the way they were, and the social context was the way it was, there's a high need for communication, empathic communication that takes account of all of the hardship and all of it. And then there's, of course, a lot of need for paying attention to this investment in the social sector, in amelioration and all of that. So those are some of the issues we have to look at today.
So we will expand a little more, and I'm hoping that we will come to discuss monetary policy in a moment. But speaking of policies and a potential for reversal, I'll come to you, Dr. Shoaibu, because you've got experience, right, when it comes to implementing policies. You've done research into it. If we were to see some sort of backtracking, maybe not the full backtrack, right, of the major reforms that have been undertaken, what would that do for our potential, the forecast growth, right? What would that do? We also have to discuss the economic impact, the political impact it will have. There's also the question on whether the administration can present itself as being serious if they're backtracking on something they said was needed to push us forward.
Okay, thank you for that very interesting question. I think, as others have mentioned, that there have been bold reforms that have taken place, but unfortunately they've had unintended consequences. And this ranges from high inflation, poverty, and pushing about 10 million people into poverty as at the end of 2023, with poverty at over 30%. I think that's a serious problem. But linking to what Dr. Abaje has said earlier about the timing and sequencing of reforms, I think that really matters a lot. I mean, there's really nothing wrong with the reforms per se, in my opinion. I think the issue is what are the safety nets and other things that have been put in place to help buffer the shocks, especially for the most vulnerable groups. For example, we've seen the inflationary pressure that has been induced by, these reforms. We've seen inflation go up by over 30%, for example, headline inflation. And then we have also seen that food inflation has gone by over 40%, which has become a serious challenge, right? And this has a lot of political implications as well as socioeconomic implications. So the idea behind this, I think, would have been to initiate some form of buffers, right, to help mitigate the impact of these reforms, especially for the most vulnerable groups. Now, two things easily come to mind. For example, the government is currently embarking on this social safety net program, but I don't think it is adequate because it's targeting 15 million people. And we know that some of these programs are not perfect, even in developed countries, right? So you're going to have moral hazard problems, adverse selection, so you're not likely going to get the real targeted groups. So it's important that this program is really scaled up, because if you have 30 million people, if you have 30% poverty rate, and you're looking at a population of about 233 million estimated, right, then we're talking about 60 million people in poverty. So the social transfer programs does not even meet 50% of the actual, groups that actually need this help. So I think that should have been in place. And then the second part I would have looked at is the minimum wage. I think that should have come almost immediately after the reforms. And, looking at the minimum wage, we're talking about, for example, from in 2015, it was about 18K, and then it moved to, 30K. But then if you look at the inflation factor, that 30K today is about just about 5,200 if you do the numbers, right? So I think those are some of the steps that should have been taken. But going forward, I think if we're able to scale up these social protection programs, right, and implement this minimum wage, for example, you can have a minimum. The 62K being proposed, I think, is grossly inadequate. I think it would be important to look at a worst-case scenario, depending on fiscal consolidation reforms that are taking place, how much revenue the government is able to make. I think if you're able to have a worst-case scenario of, say, 115K, for example, this also factors in the average spending of Nigerian households, right, that has been, provided by the National Bureau of Statistics. So if you factor that in, the worst case scenario is probably 115K. And then, the best case scenario would be to go 145K. Now, these numbers, I'm leaning on the study by the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, right? And I think it's really important that, the minimum wage is also gauged against inflationary pressure. Because if you pay 62K, it still doesn't do much, to be honest, right? Because it still goes in real terms, it doesn't go more than 10,000.
I mean, there's a whole other conversation or related conversation around the ability to afford this minimum wage and how the larger percentage of workers do fall under the subnational level. Subnationals that have been unable to pay 30,000 naira for many of them in the last 5 years. That's a conversation we will come to, but I do want us to look at monetary policy a little deeper, right? And Mr. Alaja, I'll come to you for this. The CBN governor is on record as saying that he's looking to see, or rather the CBN is going to be returning to orthodoxy when it comes to monetary policies. Considering the precarious situation the economy was in when the administration took office, the IMF has downgraded our growth forecast for this year to 3.1% from 3.3%.
3.7.
So is orthodoxy the way to go? Is that the right approach?
Well, for me, I would say that I've studied carefully some of the policies central bank have made regarding the economy and what the central bank is considering. I think most of the time we theorize the problems, and it's important to know that economics emphasizes that you cannot clap with one hand. The central bank and monetary policy committee most of the time attempt to look at the issues on the surface. I'll give you an instance. You hear that money supply has increased over 100 trillion in the economy. But is that argument really correct? I don't think so. Last year, what was the quality of money in the economy? So the 100 trillion naira you are seeing the economy today will be necessarily so because times are harder, inflation is high, people will need to have more money to buy or to spend. So if you, because of that, make a policy of increasing interest rates, it has implications. You'll be spinning your own tail or you'll be chasing your own tail. And in fact, it will lead to more problems. So rather than inflation reducing, inflation would in fact increase, poverty would increase, unemployment will increase, stagflation would increase. And ask me, is that what we have experienced? The answer is yes. So we have increased interest rates for an economy that is battling with acute hunger. In fact, when the two policies were made, World Bank advised and IMF advised and said the last president is leaving us with a patching chart of 5 million people poor between January to May 2023. And that was a report that was published in June 2023 by one of the organizations. And projected that if the president made this policy as good as it appears, I'm talking about the new president, but not less than 7 million people will get into poverty bracket. If nothing is done about it, the question is something done about it. Governors were given rice to share. Just yesterday, we had about 20 bags of rice.
20
we go
trucks.
to 20 bags of rice.
Trucks.
20 trucks of rice. That's 600. 600 is one truck. Multiply that by 20 and check how many households are in Wuse 2? How many households are in Araba? How many households are in Akampa? How many households are in Arkila? And mention it. Will that solve the problem? You know what that will lead to? More high price in rice because you are not following the traditional method. You see so much such at the same time. Scarcity will be around and you're going to see even more increase. So I stay with the CBN question before I hang on. So this is what you see. Some of the policies, policy decisions, most of the time we don't look at the outcome. That is why inflation and unemployment are high at the same time. Why? Because when you increase interest rates, what you are going to see is that you crowd out two things. The first thing you crowd out is investment. Persons that have borrowed money from back will have to pay more, and new borrowers will be discouraged. Now, when they are discouraged and people have to still buy anyways, prices will go up because they say, well, we don't have enough money and we still have to buy. So that on one hand. What if investment is not continuing or is not growing in a country? What does that mean? High unemployment. And central bank will say, okay, so prices of the few goods will also increase because we import. Why? We have four ways of spending money. Marginal propensity to consume MPC, marginal propensity to save part of the money you save, marginal rate of taxation, part of the money you put in taxes, and the most important for developing countries, especially Nigeria, marginal rate of imports. And all of us can ask our first question. Of 100,000, 10,000, 1,000 with you, of these four ways, import, local production, taxes, and savings, which takes most of your money? It's obvious from our dresses, even though some people may wear what you call traditional dress, but I can't tell you the fabric is not made in Nigeria. And if you're a woman, you also have foreign hair. You call woman, even though you are a human being, it's also imported. Some people impregnate their wife, export them, and import them back into Nigeria. It's a pattern. Now, how do you combat such economy with mere monetary policy that is not targeting agro-processing, that is not targeting manufacturing and production? And that is why no matter how much we continue in this cycle, when we are ready, Chinese proverb says, when the students are ready, the teacher will show up.
So, Mr. Laja, I mean, a comical but very critical contribution that you made. Now, Mr. Hassan, I want us to, I've seen a criticism, right, that the CBN leadership is more heavy-handed on monetary policies than it is on fiscal policies. Some have gone as far as saying that it doesn't seem to have the capacity to drive fiscal policies that help to balance out. Do you agree with this assessment?
I think the immediate past speaker had actually being able to speak the language that Nigerians would understand. In days of crisis like we are into, where almost every Nigerian, I should say, is in crisis, and this time around, it does not matter how much you have in your bank accounts or what have you, because in a country that is actually suffering from these chronic ailments, kind of, whatever pulse you take about Nigerian economy, it's not well. What I mean by that, you take whatever parameter that economic elites will talk about that defines the quality of health of an economy, you find that basically nothing is within normal range. I think our listeners would understand what I'm talking about. Now, amidst this kind of turmoil, economic turmoil, a lot of jargons will be spoken about how this policy will work and this policy will not work. One of the biggest challenge that our economic managers have had, I think, is something that I can draw out of the conversation of the immediate past. I think the monetary policy and the fiscal policy are only literally talking to each other, but technically, they are not speaking to each other. While the central bank in its, monetary policy management framework would always have to tinker with one of those parameters, money supply kind of a thing, interest rates, and those kind of a thing, believing and probably suggesting that these are the things that will be done to manage inflation and create employment and then stability, monetary stability that we need in the economy. Unfortunately, immediately an action is taken, the fiscal policy management side of the government, which of course entails the government, the ministry, the president, and everybody, will go and do a thing and do an action that will probably reverse or negative the entire effect that the other policy is going to create. Now, eventually, the net result will be that the economy will suffer, Nigerians will suffer. Now, if you just oppose the two so far, coming from the first year upward, the May 29 upwards, what we have seen is counter cyclical policy, wherein the monetary policy side will decide on moving variable A, B, because it's said in the books and in theory that when you increase interest rate, it tends to reduce money in circulation, and then people will not have enough to spend and consume. And so that's pressure on the fact that demand would come down would bring down inflation. And that's absolute theory. It doesn't work, and it will not work in a country like Nigeria, coming out from a country that has been ravaged by security crisis for over a decade and a half, a country that contributes the highest population of hungry people in Africa, a country where the rate of unemployment is highest in Africa, and kind of every parameter that you take, we top the best, the worst 10, in Nigeria and so on. So therefore, I'm suggesting, I think it's time for our economic management teams to begin to speak at each other technically, right, not just literally, that we hear from day to day.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan. Now, we will come to audience interaction in a moment, but I want to quickly get a comment from Mr. Azubair. They paint a bleak picture, right? And this does come back to the question of how the creative economy would thrive in such an environment.
Right.
So perhaps to add a little more, right? I'm curious about whether the ministry is keeping in touch with this reality, especially from the different arms of government, and how the ministry is adjusting accordingly, whether that's by expectation, whether that's by efforts, whether that's by reviewing even the 8-point agenda.
I appreciate that you brought this question, because I think it's easy from the remarks I gave earlier to talk about some of the successes we've been able to record and the rest of it. But as my very esteemed co-panelists have identified, that's something we don't do very well everything that we do in terms of our industrial strategy, siloed. We have had one of the big challenges that as a ministry we've been trying to address is our ability from a policy perspective to work across the board with partners within government to be able to roll out policies. Because what Nigeria does least well, unfortunately, is also the thing that we need most, which is cross-cutting, long-term, developed policy that works across multiple sectors and addresses really complex, multifaceted issues. So yes, we recognize that this is an issue. It's something that we've tried to address through, and I think the presidency, to its credit, has actually, with the establishment of, let's say, the CDCU, which is the centralized coordination unit, to try and make sure that this siloed effect is addressed. We ourselves, even on a policy perspective, have engaged with with the IMTS, so interministerial committees and the rest of it. But there's a lot of work to be done on that front. I think that's crystal clear from what has been described when different arms and branches of government are not able to properly engage and interact with each other.
Thank you for that, Mr. Azubair. I mean, from what has been said by the panel of experts, it's clear that in terms of the coordination aspect, we're not getting it right. And this administration introduced the coordination unit that's supposed to help streamline. We are waiting to hear of any sort of major moves from that particular unit. And I'm sure that we'll get a chance to hear sooner, hopefully, rather than later. At this point, right, we will take a quick break. When we return, the audience will engage with the panel of experts on this conversation. Stay with us. This is the first year. Welcome back. This is the first year, a town hall production by Daria Media, supported by the MacArthur Foundation. I'm Nabila Usman, and so far we've been discussing the economy under the stewardship of President Bola Tinubu and his economic team. At this point, I'd like to hand over the reins to my colleague, Stephen Imediogu. Stephen will be handling the questions from social media and the audience here in the studio.
Thank you, Nabila. As you know, Daria Media and the MacArthur Foundation are bringing you this conversation. And it's not just a conversation for the experts and the panelists, it's also a conversation that involves our audience. And that's why we're directing you to make use of the microphones across the hall if you want to ask questions. For those who are watching us online, who are listening via other platforms, including radio, you can use the hashtag Daria Media, hashtag first year. Direct your questions to our X handle at the Daria Media NG. Right now, we'll take a question from Mr. Celestine Okudili Odo. Mr. Odo.
Okay, I can sit here. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to the panel of experts. I think you've given us insight into the present context of our economy. It's so unfortunately that all the indicators, economic variables are negative. For me, I don't think there's a single positive indicator in the economy currently as it is. Yeah, the poverty is growing, inequality is expanding. I know before the removal of the fuel subsidy, MBS said 133 million Nigerians under multidimensional poverty. But with the removal of fuel subsidies, electricity, devaluation of the naira, I'm sure this figure must have changed. Yeah? So the question is to all of us, unfortunately, the ministers are not here. So what we just do here is alternative, providing alternatives, recommending alternatives. So the question here now for all the panelists is very clear. Our president has toned the line of neoliberal economy. That is exactly what is going on. From the removal of subsidy, devaluation, and all that. And this has huge consequence for us as a country. So the question is that the right path? What's the alternative? Secondly, is the growing magnitude of public debt. We know where we are now, and we know as of 2015 where we was. That was about 12 point something billion dollars as at then. But we know where we are currently as a March is about 90 something billion dollars, about 120 something trillion. It's so unfortunate. So what is the alternative in terms of domestic resource mobilization? If we are in a situation, emergency situation, with regards to the economy, and something needs to be done urgently. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Odo, for that question. Gentlemen? Right, carry on, sir.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Agbaje.
Let me attempt to respond to that question, even though I don't like when economic questions are framed in an ideological manner. So I won't talk about neoliberal or liberal. But it's clearly what is common to the president's policy since May 2023, is a clear turn, and he did say it in the clip you showed, a clear turn towards markets. A return to a market-based policy orientation, as opposed to what he inherited, which was clearly a preference for government control, a planned government-controlled economy. And so whether it's fuel subsidy or deregulation or electricity pricing, the common theme is clearly a return to markets. Before I answer your question directly, let me remind us of something that has been said that may not have been stressed sufficiently. To be fair, to whether it's the central bank or the policymakers on the fiscal side, the country was more or less a bankrupt country. There's no simple, easy way to fix Nigeria. That's the bad news. Our central bank had $3 billion left of reserves. $3 billion. We had sold oil forward. We had borrowed against our reserves, in effect, pledged our savings. We had pledged our production of oil. The central bank was more or less illiquid. And on the oil side, the state of the NMPC was similar to that of the central bank. We had sold oil, and we're still dealing with forward sales of crude oil. Revenue position was mentioned that we were spending almost 90-something% of our revenues to service new debt. Insecurity. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's bust our bubbles. It's not that these people don't know what they're doing. There is no fine way, easy way, comfortable way to fix the Nigeria that we inherited on May 2023. That's my view. That's what the evidence suggests. Now, so if what we judge policy by is that has it fixed things in an easy way? Obviously, the answer will always be no. However, I think that some of the, and I said so, however, some of the choices have been suboptimal. I don't think, so I said I don't want to talk about whether it's neoliberal or liberal, but we could not have continued with the fuel subsidies. We should, in my view, have done a managed float. So not free the market. We needed to adjust the value of the currency given the circumstances we were in. But we should have been more careful. Maybe even the timing was wrong. If you had $3 billion in reserves, it was not the time to deregulate your currency. So for me, can you get your electricity sector to work and to be sustainable if there's no cost recovery? I don't think so. So there are no easy answers. We're in a mess. We were more or less almost bankrupt. It's going to be a difficult period. We are yet to begin to respond in the sustainable ways that we address our economy for the future.
Right. Mr. Agbaje, thank you.
Such as growing exports.
Thank you very much.
So those are the things that need to happen.
We do apologize, but we are pressed for time. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, I'm going to ask that you keep your questions as brief as possible. Go straight to the point, and you can direct them to a specific member of the panel. Mr. Jake Epeli, we have a question from you.
Thank you. Thank you. About 16% of the population in the country are persons with disability, and that's my constituency. And I'm just going to ask anyone, probably ask Dr. Paul to give us his perspective on whether it's financial inclusion that is not included in any government framework, or employability of persons with disability, again, which is a struggle, or cultural issues. And my good friend here brought in a lot of perspective on cultural issues, but little was said about persons with disability. And of course, finally, political participation and appointment of persons with disability. This government in particular took what may look like a right step by appointing senior special assistant on for persons with disability. But must we continue in that trajectory? Can't we get a minister with persons with disability? So talk to us on inclusion in general. What's the way forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Epeli. Just before that question is answered, we're going to take two more questions from the audience and then come back to the panel. Mrs. Hawa Booth, your question, please.
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you to the the panel of experts for showing up. My question is directed to, sir, please, your name? Yes, you. Yes, please. My problem is just the high level breakdown of what the economy is. And since you gave some very nice examples, could you please break down, this is like economy for dummies now, of which I'm one. Please, could you break down what floating the naira means? Was this the only thing that was necessary to be done at this time? If the answer is no, what in your opinion should have been the first thing that should have been done that probably could mitigate our situation? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll take one more question. All right, panelists, Mr. Bekeba and Dr. Adio, you had something to add to the first question. Let's take that very quickly, and then we answer the other two questions that came from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. It's actually Mr. Adio. Before I'll be, people will think I'm misrepresenting myself. Okay, the first thing I want to say, in response to what Dr. Alaji said around what's it called, interest rate, and I think this is a very popular view, right? But the only government agency that has the statutory responsibility for managing inflation is the central bank. And the only tool that the central bank has for managing that is with its monetary instruments, especially in terms of rates, right? So you have the option of doing nothing, because what central bank was dealing with was that inflation was already high. So it's either you do nothing or you do something. Across the world, when inflation is high, the tool that central banks can use is to increase interest rates, right? But does that mean that everything about our inflation is driven by by money supply? No. There are some other dimensions to it. But you cannot say central banks should not do anything. At the same time, what you need to do is, like the other gentleman said, you need proper coordination between the fiscal side and the monetary side, so that what this one is doing is not being undermined by this one. Whereas central bank is tightening, the fiscal side cannot be on an expansionary mode. right? So that is why that coordination is very important. But you cannot say, central bank do nothing because, the only cause of it's not just, yes, there's insecurity, there's supply chain issues, there are so many issues. But the major driver of inflation is that the previous government, borrowed 27 trillion. That is what we're all paying for. That 27 trillion will pass through somewhere. Right. So, and the only way you can do with it, I'm not speaking for central banks. Unfortunately, they are not here. But I don't think the option they have is to do nothing. What we need to do is to make sure that there's proper coordination in government, that all the sides, they are speaking to themselves, like he said, and they are on the same page. Right. So that's in terms of that. Floating is not my question, but I can just say something. You can, if you believe that your currency is overvalued, which everybody thinks that the naira was at some point, right? But there were some other issues. We had multiple official exchange rates, which created rules for all kinds of sharp practices, right? So that is the first thing you need to deal with. All the official rates, exchange rates, consolidate them, right? You might need to bother about narrowing the official and the parallel market rates. That's a separate issue. So, but if you think that you need to, so the first step is have one official rate. The second one is that adjust your, what's it called, exchange rate, the official exchange rate gradually, which we have done over time. There was a time when it was 199, it went to 2 something, it went to 3 something, it went to 4 something, right? So you can keep adjusting that, right? So, but if you think that you want to floating means that you leave it to the market, willing seller, willing buyer. So if you are ready to buy at 1,000 naira and somebody is ready to sell at 1,000 naira, that is the market rate, right? For you to be able to do that, especially based on some other issues, we did not even know the extent of our reserve. The reserve that we had was supposed to be $34 billion. It was audio. There's an agency that said our reserve was even negative. So people took action without even having enough information, not being led by evidence or by data. Right. So, but if you want to, sorry, let me land on this point. If you want to float, right? What's it called? Egypt showed us what you need to do. You need to make sure that you have enough firepower to defend your currency. And Egypt did that in March. They made sure that they got enormous money from World Bank, from others, including from UAE, that bought land from them. They got $35 billion from UAE. So if you had enough supply, then you can decide to float. Now that we are floated, we have put the cart before the horse. What we need to do now is that we need that strong supply. Not going to Afri-Exim for 3.3, not going to World Bank for $2.2 billion. No, you drop that, it's like a drop in the ocean. The value will stabilize. Within 2 weeks, you get back to it to go up. As long as you don't, the major problem with dollar supply in Nigeria is that there's more demand, there's higher demand than supply. And as long as you have that, the price of dollar will continue to go up.
Thank you, Mr. Adio. Mr. Alaja, there are 2 questions coming to you, one of which is on the diversity inclusion. The other is the question on breaking down the floating of the naira, if it was the only thing necessary to have been done.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so very much, sir. I need to quickly correct an impression because we are speaking to the public, and this is a national media. Central bank is not the only agency to control inflation. In economic theory, it is so. But in applied economy, which is just 2 steps away, you realize that central bank is not the only agency to control inflation. And I would explain.
But that's not what I said.
I quoted you.
I said the organization that has the statutory responsibility.
Gentlemen,
but at the same time, there's need for coordination.
Mr. Adio.
Because the only driver of inflation is not just money supply. I said that.
Right. Mr. Adio, if you could allow Mr. Alaje to finish his answer. Mr. Alaje, please continue.
I'm sorry about that. Now, if you read the reports published by the Bureau of Statistics, the real driver of our inflation is food inflation. If we want to combat this inflation, one policy we must implement is creating farm ops all around different parts of the country. Target the food grains that are scarce and is inducing the price to go high. Our policy should be solution driven and it should come from the supply side, which is one correct thing that I agree with my co-panelists that he mentioned. So for me, central bank is not the only agency. If you allow only central bank, and you see as an organization with statutory responsibility, it's like carrying the load of the entire world on one leg while you are raising the other leg up. Economics is a tripod. You need fiscal, monetary, and trade. And that will take me to the other question. I will answer Mr. Ekpele's question last because it's social integrated into economics. So that I deal with all the economics questions together. Somebody asked about market question, and which is so very key. Again, it is not wrong whether we practice neo-capital, how he said it, or social. What matters is that do we fulfill the assumptions? For you to practice the kind of economy we are running, one major assumption we must not violate, which we are violating, is supply side. If our supply is lean, if it is thin, then we'll be quite chocolate. Our economy, we have robust tummy because we are eating only carbohydrates. So it's going to have tremendous negative impact on us. How do we boost supply? Talking about explaining the meaning of floating rates and what it means in economics. You need to picture one person called Mr. Macaroni. I don't know if you know Mr. Macaroni, very popular on social media. Imagine Mr. Macaroni was going to engage in a boxing contest with Anthony Joshua. You know that Momiwa must buy a stretcher. Now, that is what happens when a naira without capacity, without quality demand in terms of export, wants to compete freely with the dollar. We must be joking. The policy we should have implemented, because there's an alternative, what we should have done is we know that we cannot win this battle. We should have done what we call milestone adjustment for 400 to 600. Pressure will always come. And that is why, for me, I always doff my cap for the current Emir of Kano, the former central bank governor. He faced more severe pressure, but he never bowed down because our nation must come first. President Buhari, when he was in office, he said, I'm not an economist, but it does not sound right that we devalue our currency, knowing fully well that we don't have enough to export. So promoting devaluation without robust exports will bring us to where we are. And I want to advise those, authorities, especially the central bank and the government of the day, that we need to stop this flotation. United Arab Emirates is a country known for tourism. I know they have some quality effects and they have some crude. But why is it that that country has never changed in terms of what the RAM is to the dollar? Since how many years ago? 2012, 2015, 2018 till date. It is still 3.65 dirhams to the dollar. Nigeria has crude oil. Nigeria has all mineral resources. Wait, we say that it is what we export. So it's not to have the crude on our leg that matters. It is to use our brain to export it, sell to the rest of the world, even refine that can make us get there. So I will answer Mr. Ekpele's question, which is the last question. So for me, we cannot say we are building a robust nation without including critical stakeholders. And that is why I've advised places where I've had opportunities to talk to those who are in government at the subnational level. We must demonstrate that we are one. We must demonstrate that we are people of love by including persons with disability because they are critical stakeholders. And I will continue to say this anywhere I have the opportunity to say it. I also hope that someday the president, whether now or in the future, will look at this critical population, about 16% of the entire population, and bring one of those persons to show that we are people of love, and not just because we want to bring them. There are many of them that are doing well in different areas of life, not because you are a person with disability, therefore. We have to look at their performance, how they've succeeded in different areas of life, then bring them forward. Then we know that we are not discriminating, that indeed we are one nation.
Mr. Alaje,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your answers. We do not have enough time to take any more questions, so we return the floor to my colleague, Nabila Usman.
We will be taking a break in a moment, but I do want to take this opportunity to say that we extended an invitation to the central bank as well as senior ministers of the administration who have a direct impact on the economy And if you remember earlier, I did say that unfortunately they couldn't make it. It's our hope, especially from a media perspective, that the administration will understand the importance of engaging with the Nigerian media, engaging with the Nigerian people. Earlier, a comment was made about the importance of communication. So hopefully we'll get some answers sooner rather than later. At this point, we will go on a quick break. When we return, I'll come back to the conversation with our panel of experts as we take final thoughts. This is the first year. Stay with us.
There's a range of executive orders which Mr. President has signed and which are being gazetted to ease the cost of doing business at this particular time. There are a number of funding which will reduce the cost of interest, reduce the interest rate for certain sectors in the economy, the small and medium scale in particular, but also some larger companies.
I keep saying our own issues are not that bad. This economy can be turned around within few months, and I think we're on that way.
It's all about giving economic hope to our people. It's all about creating jobs, for our young ones. So we hope that with the private sector working with the federal government under President Tinubu, that things will begin to improve.
First year, a town hall production by Daria Media, supported by the MacArthur Foundation. I'm Nabila Usman, and over the last hour plus, we've been discussing the state of the economy with a panel of experts. As we go into the final few minutes of this conversation, I'd like us to bear in mind that this is an expansive conversation, not one that ends here. And I will be directing specific questions to my panel of experts who will share those thoughts. I'll start with you, Mr. Azubair. I'm aware and I'm conscious that this is we've had a strictly economic conversation in the last 30 minutes to an hour. However, this does highlight why it's important to ask whether the ministries that aren't pure economics in that way understand the gravity of the task at hand. And I'd like you to speak on how we optimize the Ministry of Arts, Culture, and Creative Economy to contribute over the next 3 years.
Thank you for such an interesting question, and I'll try and keep it again succinct because it's a very expansive question. The first thing I would say is I think you can use the Ministry of Culture as an example of the cascading element of the centrality of the economic aspect. What I mean by that is basically, by and large, you wouldn't really consider the Ministry of Culture to really be involved with the economic. So the extent to which it's important to us is probably quite indicative of how important it must be to all the ministries which are more closely aligned with an economic agenda. And so what I can say to that is we have two key metrics that we are using and that we are being judged on. That is a $100 billion contribution to the economy by 2030, and that is creating 2 million jobs. Those are the two key high-performance indicators which are going to, that our entire mandate it's going to be judged on. There are others, which is, as you mentioned, the CDC, which will also be evaluating, but those are the ones. Now, in terms of delivery, that's a question for the ages. It requires fundamental restructuring. As my learned colleagues have already mentioned, it's about that industrial policy. Delivering industrial policy requires technical capacity. We need to be serious about our civil service capacity. And I think that's probably the best thing we could do about delivering long-term industrial strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Azubair. And it's important to note that continuity is very important. The minister is not likely to be minister up until 2030. So hopefully we will see carryover of agendas accordingly. Dr. Shoaibu, I'm coming to you. You earlier spoke about the national minimum wage. There have been concerns that raising this will also impact inflation. We could likely see it increase. So speak to us on just being able to manage this expected action and the outcome.
Okay, thank you, Nabila, for that question. I think the minimum wage should have been something addressed much earlier. But notwithstanding, I think it would be interesting to decide or to look at it. The decision on what the actual minimum wage should be, I think, should be strictly empirical and not just based on any other criteria, but it should be empirical. In other words, you need to look at the consumption basket of Nigerian households using the Nigerian Household Survey, and basically sort of have a minimum worst case scenario and a best case scenario, which I have mentioned. There's a study that has shown that, the worst case scenario, the minimum at least should be 115K per month for each person. And that's important. That is because each household, basically, you factor in all their spending, transportation, energy, education, and all of that, right? So 115 would be the minimum. It might not be very adequate, but I think it's a good starting point for the negotiations, and then you can go as high as 145, depending on government's fiscal space.
Thank you, Dr. Shaibu. Ms. Adio, for you, I'm looking at how we balance the independence of the CBN, where monetary policies come to place, and the rest of the government that handles the more fiscal side of things. Collaboration versus independence.
Well, yes, independence is very important, but the CBN is not an island by itself. They also have to respond to what is going on in the economy and also make sure that they also collaborate with others. They have their their remit. There are certain things they cannot get into. CBN is not involved with budgeting, with taxation, and all of those other things. So, but overall, what I would like to say is that there's need for proper coordination of the fiscal, and the monetary side. But having said that, I would also like to say to address a few other things just quickly.
Very quickly,
yes,
we have
the
limited
first thing
time.
is that it is possible to do the right thing in the wrong way. So that is something that is not enough to say I'm doing the right thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that policymakers must always act on time, because if you don't act on time, so much damage could have been done that you could end up doing the right thing, but end up losing the patient.
Thank
The
you,
last
Mr.
thing I
Adio.
want to
2
say.
out of 3 is very perfect.
Okay.
I apologize, but I do
That's
want to
fine.
get final thoughts from the rest of the panel. Mr. Agbaje, very quickly,
Thank
right?
you.
What are the prospects of our economy doing well if issues around transparency of information, we're working with a budget that's already set to fail. What happens next?
Well, I think it's clear that the short term will still be.
Okay. You can go ahead.
The short term, it will still be difficult because we have subsidies that are still there, irrespective of anything we say. We have electricity prices that are in process of being fully deregulated. So there are still inflationary factors. And like Waziri, I'd like to make a final point.
Very briefly, sir.
Yes. So, one, there are multiple factors that cause inflation. For instance, insecurity causes food inflation, and is not necessarily in the province of the central bank. However, the only agency that has statutory power and tools to tackle inflation, interest rates, and all of that is the central bank. My
Mr.
second point,
Agbaje,
in closing,
I must.
is that
1
we've
out of 2
had
is a
fixed
perfect.
exchange rates for 8 years.
All right, sir.
Where did it land us?
We'll keep that. We'll peg it. We'll peg it. Mr. Alaje, there's been quite a bit of focus on FDI, foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, and there's a criticism that it seems like we're positioning more for an external view than for the people who are hungry right now. How do we balance that?
Well, we need all the investment we can get. Investment is very important to create jobs. Also, we need to take care of our own people. I think in making policy, we must know that policy action must be driven by expected policy outcomes. For instance, before removing subsidy, refineries should have worked. No matter everything, all the things you are saying, it won't work. Two, for us Is time up?
I must apologize. Once the number starts counting, yes. Mr. Hassan, you spoke about the importance of communication, and we've stressed that through this conversation. So speak to us about how that can possibly change our lot over the next 6 months into the end of this administration. Very briefly, sir.
I think communication should not just be about the spoken words. It should be about the actions of the government that delivers. As long as the policy actions or policy alternatives are not delivering and making meaningful impacts in the lives of people, communication would only remain rhetorical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's today's conversation on the first year. Clearly, it will take a carefully thought out and properly implemented series of policies to, first of all, halt our negative slide, especially regarding inflation, and secondly, to turn the economic tide in favor of Nigeria. According to our panel of experts, coordination is key when implementing policies which can help us realize our full potential. It is our hope that we will see a stronger economy that works for the Nigerian people and gives citizens a chance to live meaningful lives. On behalf of Daria Media, Stephen and I would like to extend a big thank you to the panel of experts who accepted our invitation. Our gratitude, of course, to the MacArthur Foundation for its continued support, and to you, our audience, here in the studio and at home. Join us again tomorrow on the first year from 11 a.m. We'll be in conversation with the Chief of Defense Staff, the Minister of Defense, Senior Special Advisor to the President on Policy and Coordination, as well as the Minister of Agriculture and Food Security. They'll be responding to questions on security and governance so far under the administration of President Bola Tinubu. I'm Nabila Usman. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you.